Welcome, everybody. It's really exciting to have you here today. My name is Dr. Brad, professor in the LeBron James Family Foundation School of Education. We are truly excited that you've joined us today. We have a phenomenal speaker, and I know that we have a lot of teachers in the house. If you're a teacher, maybe studying to be a teacher, you just kind of put your hand up. So how about a round of applause for all these teachers? Thank you for all the wonderful work that you're doing on behalf of families and kids and students, and how deeply appreciative we are of that. And thankful for everybody that has joined us tonight with acclaimed historian Dr. Peter Hayes for this session on big business and Nazi Germany. I should say tonight would not have been possible without the wonderful support of the Ohio Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission, who you'll hear from here in a second. Just a few housekeeping notes. Make sure you please silence or mute your cell phones or electronic devices if you haven't done that. I'm always that person in the movie theater, so I always appreciate the reminders that go out. The restroom right out the door, it'll be kind of on the left-hand side. You'll see those. Also, we have our Holocaust Education Exhibitor Table for folks that are looking to learn more information. In fact, there's an exhibit there, an opportunity to support Holocaust education in the School of Education. We've got a group of university students that are fundraising for a class to go overseas to study about the Holocaust. So feel free to check that out. I should say I'm really humbled to serve as the director of the H. Kenneth Barker Center for Economic Education at the University of Akron. What an amazing group of people I'm really blessed to work with, the partnerships. The center was founded in 1974 as a partnership forged between the business community and between area educators, dedicated to advancing economic and financial education in classrooms and communities. Over the years, we have instructed, we have supported, we have championed thousands of elementary, middle school, high school teachers. In 2003, we received the nation's Center of the Year Award by the Council for Economic Education. The award could not have been possible without the wonderful support of the greater Akron community and members of our advisory board. And members are actually here tonight. So for those members, maybe if you could put your hands up, just be recognized. Thank you so much. So on behalf of the Barker Center, I should also say Happy Financial Literacy Month. April's Financial Literacy Month. It's a time dedicated to promoting financial education and empowerment as tariffs, inflation, spending, global events, and economic pressures fill today's and tomorrow's headlines. Improving economic and financial lives and livelihoods has never been more important. So tonight's public lecture is accompanied by the other workshops, the institutes, the study tours, and even a summer conference that the center supports. We are truly excited about tonight's featured speaker, though, which is a part of our Dollars and Difference, the Economics of Hate and Compassion speaker series. While economies and markets do not have emotions or express feelings, the ordinary human beings that design, depend upon, and participate in them do. So many of our hopes, our dreams, our goals, our everyday livelihoods depend on our economy and it working for everyone. So as for the format of tonight's talk, in a few minutes you're going to be hearing from one of our key partners, Ms. Andrea Brookover, the Executive Director of the Ohio Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission, to talk to you about the commission, which was created by the Ohio General Assembly in 2021. When she finishes, you're going to hear from one of our amazing education students, Ms. Juliana Mueller, who's going to introduce Dr. Hayes. After Dr. Hayes' remarks, Peter has graciously volunteered to take some audience questions. However, folks, You're always welcome to join us afterwards at the VIP meet and greet to continue the conversation. A few tickets remain and can be purchased at the registration table outside. So thank you for joining us tonight, and I would now like to invite to the podium Ms. Andrea Brookover from the Ohio Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission.
Thank you, Dr. Magooth. Just want to take a few moments to thank Dr. Magooth and the staff here at the Education Center and the support of the Holocaust programming in particular. Just a quick and dirty snapshot of the Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission. We are a commission that are served by 12 governor-appointed commissioners, 3 members of the governor's cabinet, and we have 4 paid staff, all committed to ensuring that Holocaust and genocide education is accessible to all Ohioans to build a more informed and engaged society. We achieve this vision by supporting educators and students, connecting them to high-quality resources for teaching and learning about genocide, and by providing funding for interactive learning experiences at museums, exhibits, and memorials across the state. We have funded field trips and speaker engagements for over 4,000 students so far this academic year, and have provided classroom book sets like Ely Cassell's Night to schools in need around the state. We are partnering with Ohio institutions of higher ed, like the University of Akron, to create programs and courses in Holocaust and genocide studies for our undergraduate and graduate students and for in-service educators. We host memorial events for communities that have experienced genocide, and with April being Genocide Awareness Month, there are many commemorations around the state, including Yom Shoah Holocaust Remembrance events. One we will have on April 23rd at the Ohio State House, 2 p.m. if anyone's interested in joining the governor's annual Holocaust commemoration event. We are also working with the Rwandan Community Association of Ohio to, for the 3rd year in a row, host Kwabuga, the commemoration of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, which will be that following Saturday, April 26th at Ohio State University. This year also marks the 30th anniversary of the Bosnian genocide of 1995 and the 50th anniversary of the Cambodian genocide of 1975. So lots of very poignant anniversaries in genocide this year. The Commission is also creating a repository of Ohio survivor testimony that will be available on our website in the near future. Not just Holocaust survivor testimony, but liberator testimony and testimonies of other genocide communities as well. Lots of great progress in just the 3 years of our operation to date, and you can keep up with our work by subscribing to our monthly newsletter, which you can do at our website at holocaust.ohio.gov. I've left some rack cards out of the tables out front that have a QR code that will take you, especially teachers in the room, to our website that has grant applications for professional development grants and for field trip grants as well. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you for just a minute, and thank you for the program. Looking forward to Dr. Hayes.
Hello, my name is Juliana Muller. I'm a 4th-year student studying education and history here at UA. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Peter Hayes. So Dr. Hayes holds degrees from Bowdoin, Oxford, and Yale, and from 1980 to 2016 he was a professor of history and German, and then from 2000 to 2016 he was the Theodor Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation professor at Northwestern University. His publications have won several prizes and have been translated into Chinese, French, German, Italian, Polish, Slovak, and Spanish. His works on the Holocaust include Why? Exploring the Holocaust, which was published in 2017, How Is It Possible? A Holocaust Reader, 2015, the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, 2010, and then he edited with John K. Rah and German Railroads, Jewish Souls in 2020. This was a study of deportation trains that he and Christopher Brownings assembled around 2 path-breaking essays by the late Raoul Hidberg. He has just completed a book entitled Profits and Prosecution, German Big Business and the Nazi Economy and the Holocaust, which appears both in English and German in 2025. From 2014 to 2019, Hayes chaired the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, on which he served for a total of 20 years. An award-winning teacher, he lectures widely on German and Holocaust history in the United States and abroad. And so with that, I invite him up.
you to the Barker Center and to Professor Maguth for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
The book I'm going to talk about is my swan song. I've been working on this subject for 50 years, exactly. I started in 1975, and I have written studies of individual German corporations, and I've written a book about the Holocaust and edited some, and so on and so forth. And this is my attempt to finally pull it all together and to give it some coherence. And I think I deserve credit for getting it in under 200 pages. Historians often stress the open-endedness of the stories they tell, the contingency of events that could have gone in multiple directions, had the people taking part made different choices. In a sense, my remarks today both conform to this sort of narrative and depart from it. Without questioning the general principle of indeterminacy in human affairs, I want to suggest that the key switches were thrown very early in the development of German corporate collaboration in the persecution and murder of the Jews. Probably in the first 6 months of Nazi rule, surely in the first 18 months, and well before the regime's principal policymakers had decided what that collaboration would require. Barring a change in the erratic but inexorable momentum of Nazi government policy toward ever greater viciousness, these switches were irreversible thereafter. After putting up an only half-hearted and self-serving defense of some German Jews, while many others were losing positions and property during these initial months of Nazi rule, the leaders of the nation's largest corporations simply had no persuasive, let alone safe, grounds to dissent later. As the Reich's policies radicalized, firms discerned ever-mounting reasons to take advantage of developments. In other words, the slippery slope started fast and proved steep. And this is where we note that I'm over the age of 70, and technology is a challenge. To demonstrate that point, and its enormous importance to understanding how the horrors of the Holocaust happened, I'm going to spend probably a little more time today than you would expect on the first years of Nazi rule. Please bear with me. I bet that you'll see why by the time we get to the end. In view of the 2024 election results in the United States, it is a timely, worrying, and potentially instructive story. The slope tipped downward even before Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, since a fateful ambivalence regarding anti-Semitism already pervaded the upper reaches of Germany's largest corporations. On the one hand, unlike many fervent Nazis, few executives resented Jews as economic competitors or considered the commanding heights of the German economy verjudet, Jewified. The numerical presence of Jews on the managing and supervisory boards of the country's 90 most highly capitalized firms had dropped by almost 1/3 between 1907 and 1927. On the boards of the 300 largest non-financial firms in Germany, that presence fell by almost another third during the following 5 years. By 1932, almost 2/3 of the 300 leading firms in Germany had no Jews in senior positions. Multiple causes accounted for the downward trend. Mortality among senior industrialists with no suitable heirs or Jewish successors, mismanagement by some unsuitable offspring, mergers in the late 1920s that absorbed many Jewish-owned firms into publicly traded entities, resignations during the upheaval of the Depression, and government decrees that shrank the size of corporate boards and the number on which any individual could serve. Anti-Semitism appears to have played a role in one significant case, that of the disappearance of Jews from the managing board of the chemical giant IG Farben between 1925 and 1932, but not in others. After all, many of the remaining Jews were that by heritage only, and second or third generation converts to Christianity. Few were regarded as alien in any significant sense, and virtually none took political positions significantly different from those of their Gentile colleagues. Most contemporary or retrospective accounts suggest that anti-Semitism did not quite stop at the boardroom doors, but its grasp was relatively weak inside the threshold. Nonetheless, a particular mix of anti-Semitic aversions persisted among corporate leaders. It thrived not on animosity or rivalry toward Jews one knew, but on distaste for those perceived from a distance. Two such groups aroused particular ire. First, the roughly 100,000 traditionalist Jews from Eastern Europe who had immigrated to Germany during a period of lax border controls during and shortly after World War I. They now constituted 20% of the German Jewish population, appeared uninterested in assimilation, and aroused fears of incursion by the backward and unwashed East. Second, the numerous Jewish intellectuals who criticized capitalism from prominent positions in culture and journalism, and thus offended industrialists' self-esteem. You see here three of them. The man on the left, Ernst Toller, was a famous novelist of the early 1920s. The man in the middle, Max Reinhardt, was the most prominent theater director in Germany. And the man on the right is Theodor Wolff, who was the editor of roughly the German equivalent at the time of the New York Times, which was called the Berliner Tageblatt. Uneasy with attacks on decent and accomplished Jews like themselves, but irritated by these other Jews, many corporate leaders gravitated toward a specious middle ground in policy, a fateful ambivalence typified by the diaries and papers of Fritz Rössler, the man on the left here, who was the supervisory board chairman at Degussa, a large inorganics chemical firm in Frankfurt, the successor of which is nowadays known as Evonik. Rössler expressed opposition to infringements on the livelihood and legal status of long-resident Jewish fellow citizens. But he also expressed support for measures that would, as he put it, push back Jews, particularly their cultural influence, including by imposing quotas on their admission to universities and professional schools, what in German is called the numerus clausus. Hitler, Goering, and other leading Nazis indulged this indefensible distinction drawing prior to 1933 by echoing it or avoiding the subject of Jews altogether when meeting with big business leaders, even as Nazi newspapers and marauding stormtroopers threatened a much more sweeping assault. As a result, when Hitler came to power, most of the leaders of German big business underestimated the threat that Nazi anti-Semitism posed to Jews, but already had ruled out a categorical defense of Jews. The fateful consequence of this weakness of anti-Semitism at the top of the corporate world became apparent swiftly during the spring of 1933, as the Nazi movement demonstrated its lack of deference to the nation's magnates and their scruples. At a gathering of some 24 high-ranking executives on February 20th in Berlin, to which Hermann Göring had attracted the executives with a promise that, quote, the Reichschancellor will explain his policies, unquote. Hitler made clear that he was not interested in discussing economic issues, but rather in shaking down those assembled for monetary contributions to his current election campaign. The Nazis' method was to announce that they had no intention of relinquishing power regardless of the outcome of the upcoming balloting. So the industrialist choice was between financing Hitler's win or experiencing civil war if he lost. He and Goering then departed the meeting, leading Hjalmar Schacht, who's the man on the right here, a former and future head of the German National Bank, to collect their donations, which ultimately amounted to 3 million Reichsmark. 2 weeks later, the Nazis manipulated the ground rules of the election and won 44% of the vote, and their nationalist allies another 8%. Their qualified victory set off numerous wildcat actions by Nazi party activists in factories across the country, as non-Nazi workers' representatives were compelled to resign in favor of politically acceptable figures, and pressure mounted on companies to dismiss Jewish managers, reduce the number of Jewish employees, and replace them with unemployed Nazi party members. This sort of agitation culminated in early April 1933, during and following the famous party-organized boycott of Jewish shops and offices. Often overlooked is another event on that day, the appearance of Otto Wagner, the man on the left here, at the time the leader of the Nazi Party's Economic Policy Office. His appearance at the offices of the National Association of German Industry. He demanded the dismissal of 2 of the organization's business managers, their replacement by 2 government-approved appointees, and the removal of all Jews from the organization's governing board. As it happened, the association's president, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the man who there is in the middle, was meeting at that very moment with Hitler. And when he learned later that day of the demands, he begged the Führer to rescind them. After Hitler said no 2 days later, Krupp caved in over the protests of several other board members whom he silenced by threatening to resign. This was the first fateful turning point, as business capitulated to an entirely extra-legal demand, backed only by naked political power, and it occurred only 2 months after Hitler came into office. Thereafter, Krupp clung to what one historian has called a strategy of ingratiation. I prefer the word appeasement, hoping to maintain industry's influence over government economic policy by cooperating with the regime's political goals. Most of German big business fell in line behind this ultimately futile policy because they could not agree on an alternative, and because they liked other Nazi policies, such as smashing the trade unions. But both lack of conviction about defending Jews and fear of personal consequences contributed to the inertia. The mixed feelings that many executives harbored toward Jews meant that the most they could expect from the corporate world, at least in public, was the sort of temporizing defense that Karl Friedrich von Siemens, the man you see on the right, he is the head of the firm that still bears the family name, the electrical firm, and the sort of defense that he offered in early April. He expressed, quote, the sincerest sympathy to the German Jews who are deeply rooted in our fatherland, and the hope that this period of exaggerated anti-Semitism will soon belong to history, unquote. But Siemens also endorsed the arrest of what he called Edelbolschewisten, a term that means roughly cultured communists, including what he said was, quote, a very large percentage of Jews, primarily newly immigrated ones, unquote. He then chided native-born German Jews for having failed to distance themselves sufficiently from the leftist politics of their, quote, racial comrades, unquote, and advocated the reduction of the share of Jews among lawyers and physicians, quote, to a healthy proportion that approximates the population mix, unquote. In person, as late as May 1933, a few executives, notably Karl Bosch of IG Farben on the left and Hans Walz of the Robert Bosch Corporation, tried to persuade Hitler and other leading Nazis that persecuting Jews would damage Germany, but to no avail. A behind-the-scenes effort from May to August to draft a memo for the economics ministry to the same effect, in which Karl Bosch, Krupp, and Siemens took part, resulted in a one document that endorsed the goal, quote, of bringing the views of the national government to fulfillment, unquote, but argued for proceeding slowly and avoiding economic disruption. The toothless text quickly became a dead letter. The second secret behind the general acceptance of Krupp's policy was the regime's intimidation of several highly visible corporate leaders during the spring of 1933. Paul Reusch, the man on the left there, was the head of a mining and machinery conglomerate and a dominant voice among German industrialists in the waning days of the Weimar Republic. He also owned a newspaper in Munich that the Nazis wished to control. Between March and May 1933, Nazi officials dismissed the editors and appointed new ones, confiscated Reusch's stockholding, and arrested his protesting lawyers, making their release conditional upon acceptance of the expropriation. Reusch not only gave in, but henceforth lined up behind Krupp's course, which he had initially opposed. Simultaneously, two other magnates, Philipp Reimsma, the man in the middle there, who was the head and part owner of Germany's largest cigarette producers, and Günther Quandt, the man on the right, who had the same status in the leading producer of batteries. They found themselves being investigated by the Prussian Justice Ministry for alleged instances of corruption and bribery during the Weimar Republic. Reimsma avoided arrest, but several of his leading managers did not. And he was subjected to attacks in the Nazi press and calls for his removal that came to an end only when he paid Hermann Göring a bribe of 3 million Reichsmark. Quandt's torture lasted longer and cost more. He and his chief subordinates were arrested, and a Nazi commissar was appointed to take over his plants for several months. Quandt obtained release only by paying a bail that came, according to a headline in the New York Times, to over $1 million US. He remained embroiled in expensive legal proceedings for another 2 years. Meanwhile, having gotten the intended message, both Reimsma and Quandt aligned themselves closely with the regime's policies, and Quandt became particularly active in driving Jews out of German economic positions. By the summer of 1933, the Nazi regime had shown Germany's corporate bigwigs who was horse and who was rider, as the German expression goes. The administration of this lesson involved passing threats to executives like Reusch, Reimsma, and Quandt, but lasting consequences for many Jewish firm owners, board members, managers, and even rank-and-file employees. They fell victim to a massive first purge that their Gentile colleagues saw as merely the price of a working relationship with the new regime. In the country's 300 leading industrial firms, 1/3 of the remaining Jewish managing directors and 1/4 of the supervisory directors as of January 1933 lost their posts in the first half of that year alone. By mid-1934, the respective figures came to 57% and 50%. And for firms based in Berlin, the nation's capital, almost 2/3 and more than 1/2. Changes of ownership were less extensive at this early stage, but still significant, especially in commercial fields on which the Nazis long had fixated. Department and chain stores, newspaper and book publishing, state-owned industries and utilities, and suppliers to the military, government offices, and the National Railroad. Both with respect to directorships and ownerships, some major firms acted even before the regime applied pressure, exercising what the Germans call anticipatory obedience. The Deutsche Bank quickly dismissed 2 Jewish managing board members, even though Schacht, remember him, told their colleagues this was not necessary. The Dresdner Bank hired a man named Erich Niemann, who was one of Hermann Goering's flying mates during World War I. His job was to cajole the Jewish owners of firms tied to the bank to sell out before they lost value. I'm losing track of the number of the slide. Okay. In other words, from the beginning of Nazi rule, most leading German executives regarded the Nazi onslaught on the Jews strictly through the lenses of personal and corporate self-interest. If individual managers or clients or suppliers were vital, firms tried to retain them as long as that was the case. If they were expendable, then one accepted what were called, quote, the requirements of the prevailing conditions, unquote, and extended at most help in finding jobs abroad, positive letters of recommendation, normal severance terms, and purchase prices that corresponded to the market value of what was acquired. But that value usually had been reduced, at first by the after effects of the Depression, and later by the increasing desperation of the sellers. Because the induced flight of Jewish property owners presented German big business with numerous opportunities to shelter rising profits, expand market shares, diversify, and vertically or horizontally integrate, the competition to cash in on Jews' misfortune picked up steadily. By 1937, all niceties were falling away as regional Nazi economic advisors increasingly prompted sales and influenced prices, and banks and creditors shifted from fearing the loss of Jewish owners' expertise to fearing their loss of business and thus the ability to repay. Lenders thus tipped from being sustainers of Jewish enterprises in the earliest years of Nazi rule to underminers of them by the mid-1930s. Meanwhile, firms began to take advantage of provisions that allowed them to reduce Jews' pension payments. The now defunct Dresdner Bank, which was the second largest bank in the country, emerged as a pace setter in brokering property transfers and reneging on its commitments to Jewish former employees who numbered in the hundreds. The self-interest in persecution operated particularly powerfully within the macroeconomic context that the Nazi regime created. Purging and dispossessing Jews wasn't just about gaining what they had, but it was also about pleasing the regime. In the second half of the 1930s, 2/3 of the annual growth of the German economy stemmed from state expenditures on armaments and import substitutes. The nation was a monopsony. Everybody knows what a monopoly is, right? A market controlled by one seller. A monopsony is a market controlled by one buyer. And the German corporate world was dependent on and addicted to government contracts. Increasingly, a precondition for receiving them was active cooperation in making Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. At the turn of 1937-38, the Nazi regime changed its policy from encouraging the removal of Jews from German economic life to enforcing it. The economics ministry issued a series of decrees withdrawing allocations of raw materials, foreign exchange, and government contracts from any firm with a Jewish board member or senior manager, or in which Jews owned more than 25% of the stock. Since these withdrawals meant the death of any firm that met the criteria, the decrees set in motion a complete purge of the few Jews remaining in board positions and a massive sell-off of Jewish shareholdings at increasingly party-dictated prices. The Nazi state conducted a census of Jews' assets in April 1938, and in the aftermath of the Kristallnacht pogrom of November, began insisting on the monetization of those assets. That is, the consolidation in bank accounts of all of the assets people had in liquid money. And the owners had limited access to these accounts, and then, when the deportations began, the accounts were confiscated. Corporations now became even more active and indispensable agents of persecution than previously. The major insurance firms paid the cash value of Jews' life insurance policies into those partially blocked accounts. While Eduard Hilgard, the man you see on the left, who was the head of Allianz, the largest insurance company in the country to this day, Hilgard persuaded Nazi leaders that his company did not need to pay some 50 million Reichsmarks in Jews' fire and damage claims from the pogrom by making the factually outrageous but politically convenient claim that the Jews had provoked the pogrom. Degussa, the firm I mentioned before, converted the precious metals-bearing objects that Jews had to hand over to state pawn shops. Degussa converted these into bars of gold and silver for the German National Bank. And the gold went to the German National Bank, the bars of silver went to industrial use. Meanwhile, the Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks loaned much of the capital needed for corporate takeovers and took in fees for brokering them. And the same financial institutions collected, itemized, and administered Jews' assets, restricted Jews' access to them, and then transferred the sums exacted by the Nazi state to the finance ministry. In other words, this could not have been done without the aid of private enterprise. Indicative of the degree to which corporate leaders and their firms had become constituent parts of the apparatus of persecution by early 1939 is the fact that of the activities I have just described, only Hilgard's was highly profitable. Even the brokering of property transfers turned out to be a low-margin business for banks because more assets were lost through mass liquidation of Jewish-owned firms than gained on a small number of high-commission sales. But companies felt compelled to compete, not only for the assets that the regime threw up for grabs, but also, and sometimes primarily, for political favor and the future preferences and rewards that it might bring. What the historian Neil Greger has called the normalization of barbarism among corporate policymakers became especially apparent regarding Jews' assets in the annexed regions of Austria and the Sudetenland and the subjugated protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which is today's Czech Republic, during the run-up to World War II. Once more, the Dresdner Bank was in the vanguard, gobbling up the lion's share of available financial subsidiaries and serving as the agent of corporations that belonged to the Nazi state, such as the Reichswerker Hermann Göring, or that cultivated particularly close ties with it, including Mannesmann Steel. But now, even firms that largely had refrained from takeovers within the Reich, such as IG Farben and Schering, plunged in as a means of beating out competitors. The acquirers consistently regarded it as literally none of their business that the Nazi state then generally stripped the former owners of most of the sales proceeds, however meager. Given this record, by the time World War II began, corporations, like virtually all other German institutions, were virtually pre-programmed to participate in future Nazi crimes. In fact, most of them already were so implicated in plunder and persecution that there was no turning back. Degussa had agreed to smelt the precious metals the Reich extorted from German Jews in 1939. How could it then refuse to do the same thing for the precious metals German bureaucrats squeezed from the Jews of Łódź in 1940, or even express reservations about purifying the metals that the SS later delivered to the National Bank from camps and shooting sites in occupied Poland and further east. The Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks had brokered and been party to numerous property transfers in Germany and served as transmission belts that collected, monetized, and steadily transferred Jews' wealth to the German state or to the accounts of the National Association of Jews in Germany that the Gestapo controlled in 1938 to 41. On what basis, then, would these institutions and their affiliates in occupied countries shun similar activities or cease to perform them once the deportations began? Leading German manufacturers had pursued Jewish-owned enterprises in Austria, the Sudetenland, and the Czech provinces, especially prospective competitors and or former business partners. Why would these enterprises then refrain from tempting acquisitions in the rest of the expanding German sphere? Allianz had begun insuring SS-owned factories at Dachau, and Degusa's Degesch subsidiary had started supplying Sachsenhausen with Zyklon to fumigate clothing in 1940. Why would they withhold these services from new camps farther east later? With the power and wealth of Himmler's SS obviously on the rise in wartime, the benefits of good working relations with its leadership were too great to forego for firms or individual executives jockeying for advantage within firms, and the risks of poor ties to the SS too great to assume. As a result, while first German rhetoric and then German actions turned toward annihilation as the final solution to the Jewish question, the extent of German corporate participation in the escalating criminality became largely a function of Nazi government policy. When and where government policy permitted or called for significant corporate involvement, the competitive ambitions of senior executives and their enterprises generally guaranteed that it would be available. When and where the regime saw reason to restrain corporate ambitions, the role of German big business in the Holocaust proved less than many large firms wished. Contrary to popular perception, corporate takeovers of Jewish-owned property in occupied countries were one of the spheres in which the acquisitive ambitions of big German firms were often disappointed. But when the SS asked, corporations treated it as a fitting business partner and became willing enablers of the Holocaust. The large commercial banks and their subsidiaries in occupied regions extended lines of credit to the SS and its offshoots and accepted massive deposits from them, which consisted almost entirely of sums extorted or plundered from Jews before or during their deportation. In Prague, the largest single depositor to the Dresdner Bank's affiliate was the SS Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which confiscated most of the assets of Czech Jewry. At the Dresdner Bank's subsidiary in Prague, the largest depositor was the Jewish administration of the Theresienstadt Transit Ghetto. You see an overhead and a street view here of that, to which privileged German Jews had to sign over their assets before being allowed to spend a short time in this way station on the road to death. In Krakow, about half of the cash proceeds of Operation Reinhard, the pillaging and murder of Polish Jewry, landed in the vaults of another Dresdner Bank subsidiary. Along with the banks, Germany's leading precious metals processors and insurance firms actively sought out the SS's business. Determined to preserve its market leadership, Degussa unquestionably accepted various forms of gold gathered by the SS, especially from the occupied East and the Netherlands, and refined it into some 5 metric tons of pure and fungible gold, some of which the big banks sold at a substantial profit on the open market in Istanbul. Allianz Insurance agreed to cover the shipments in both directions, from the SS to Degussa, and from Degussa to the banks and then to Turkey. Instrumental in turning Jews' assets to the Nazi state's advantage, large German firms were also vital to the realization of the largest and most murderous death camp, namely Auschwitz. In fact, the place might never have acquired that dreadful status but for two related decisions on the part of I.G. Farben's leaders in early 1941. First, they decided to build a giant synthetic fuel and rubber factory 7 kilometers east of the camp at a place called Monowitz. And second, they decided to trade building materials destined for that project to the SS in return for gravel and laborers from the small concentration camp for Polish political prisoners that had been established the year before. The first decision created an appetite for labor that alerted Heinrich Himmler to revenue-generating possibilities in the region. The second decision allowed the SS to add an extra story, an extra floor, to nearly all of the pre-existing barracks that constituted the fledgling concentration camp, and thus to increase the number of inmates. When plans emerged later in the year to build a companion camp at Birkenau, and then early in 1942 to construct 4 large buildings containing gas chambers and crematoria there, the construction firm selected was one in which the Dresdner Bank was the biggest shareholder and lender, AEG, which translates as the German General Electric, a company founded and for a long time led by members of the Jewish Rathenau family, provided the electric circuitry for that building. Once again, Allianz extended coverage for the workshops at the original camp and at the Farben factory. The Deutsche Bank's branch at Katowice, which is a nearby town, loaned the SS 2 million Reichsmarks, mostly for Birkenau, and an equal sum to Farben for its factory construction project. Having helped bring Auschwitz-Birkenau to life, I.G. Farben also aided the camp in producing death. The giant chemicals compound was part owner, albeit in a secondary capacity to its partner Degussa, in a company called Degesch, which controlled the production of Zyklon, a vaporizing pesticide that in 1941 became the principal murder weapon at Auschwitz-Birkenau. No known evidence establishes that the representatives of Farben on the board of Degesch knew of the use of their product for gasoline, but the business manager of Degesch, who was on Degussa's payroll, and the principal owner of the firm that actually sold the Zyklon to the SS, both certainly did know. And they chose to continue delivering the substance. Farben's second connection to the death toll at Auschwitz was more demonstrable and direct. It involved supplying SS doctors at the camp and other concentration camps with sulfa drugs and vaccines designed to combat dysentery, gonorrhea, tuberculosis, and typhus. These drugs were then tested for efficacy and tolerability on the inmates. In some of these experiments, half of the prisoners treated as guinea pigs died, but the total number of victims is unknown. Still, a third way in which Farben contributed to the mortality rate at Auschwitz was the firm's exploitation of thousands of inmate slave laborers at its nearby factory and coal mines. The best estimates of the death toll vary between 13,000 and 28,000 prior to the evacuation of the site in January 1945. By that time, the practice of putting camp prisoners to work in German industry had become widespread, including more than 700,000 people, spread among enterprises deemed vital to the German war effort. Farben's deal with Auschwitz for labor in early 1941 actually blazed a trail in this regard. Until then, only the construction firm Philipp Holzmann had made extensive use of ghetto or camp inmates, who had put to work on building a highway from Berlin to Łódź in 1940. But Farben's agreement with the SS still conformed to the general SS preference for locating factories near camps, not camps near factories. Volkswagen broke this taboo later in 1941 by arguing successfully for establishing a camp at its factory in Wolfsburg for inmates to work building a plant to make aluminum. These arrangements remained unusual until late 1943, when Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and Heinrich Himmler of the SS concluded that the Reich's labor shortage was so acute that Jewish camp inmates had to be put to work in multiple German factories, along with numerous non-Jews who were being recruited, rounded up all across occupied Europe. Most industrial leaders gratefully accepted the workers thus offered, concluding that they were indispensable to maintaining or increasing output, given the massive military call-ups of industrial workers and the already high rate of German female employment. The tunnel vision that pervaded industrial participation in the Holocaust especially characterized the readiness of German industry to exploit inmate labor during World War II. It amounted to a willingness to walk over corpses, which is the German translation of the English phrase, to stop at nothing. For the employment of inmate labor occurred on terms that contained perverse incentives. The SS charged a fee per inmate per day that in many cases exceeded what a German civilian laborer, especially a construction worker, would have been paid. Even when this was not the case, the relatively low productivity of inexperienced inmates offset any savings on compensation. As a result, employers sought to economize on food and housing, to drive prisoners excessively hard, and to work them long hours, at least so long as replacements were available for those who fell by the wayside. In other words, the use of so-called slave laborers became a process in which firms and their leaders reduced camp inmates to the status of a factor of production that could be used up like so many pieces of coal. Of the 1.1 million camp inmates put to work, about half for government projects like building the bunkers along the Atlantic coast and underground factories like those that made the V-2 rockets, and about half for firms that produced arms and vital materials. Of this total of 1.1 million, 500 to 600,000 perished. Participation in this crazed process, including in the massive effort in 1944-45 to bury factories underground in order to save equipment and production lines from bombing. This was fostered by executives' real fears of ouster, arrest, and execution. In 1942 alone, Paul Reusch was forced out of the leadership at his conglomerate, as well as Ernst Pönsken, who led United Steel, while the regime also succeeded in removing or disempowering all the top executives of the nation's 5 leading aircraft firms, BMW, Heinkel, Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. In 1943, 2 directors of Deutsche Bank branches, Hermann Köhler in Stuttgart and Georg Mieter in Silesia, who's the man you see there on the left, were denounced to the Gestapo by people who overheard them making disparaging remarks about Nazism and or its leaders. Not only were they both condemned to death that fall, but the Nazi national newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, published an article that made a public example of Mieter. Basically, this is what can happen to you if you talk ill of us. Around the same time, Wilhelm Ricke, the head of the Rhenish-Westphalian Electricity Works, was charged with, quote, undermining the fighting spirit, unquote, of the nation for having predicted Germany's impending defeat to colleagues. Executed in May 1944, his death is recorded today on what's called a Stolperstein, a stumbling stone. That's the brass plaque that you see there in the middle, which is on a sidewalk in front of his last residence in the city of Essen. And what that says is arrested the 20th of October, 1943, charged with undermining the fighting spirit. That's what that long word, Wehrkraftzersetzung, means. And then it says executed on the 2nd of May, 1944, at the Berlin-Plötzensee prison, which is where all the leaders of the German resistance movement and the attempt to kill Hitler in 1944, which is also where they were executed. Finally, in the late stages of the war, the regime repeatedly scapegoated corporate leaders for breakdowns in output or air defenses by alleging sabotage. Rudolf Blom, the man you see there on the right, the head of his family's shipbuilding firm, was one of the victims of this. Erich Zipprich, the chief engineer of BMW, and 2 leaders of submarine makers, namely Wilhelm Scholz of Deutsche Werft and Karl Stapelfeld of a Krupp subsidiary, all faced such charges. Throughout the descent of German corporate conduct, from the abandonment of Jewish colleagues in 1933, through profiting off Jews' dispossession and murder, to working Jews to death, the leading executives embodied the thoughtlessness, the indifference to the people on the receiving end of their deeds that Hannah Arendt defined as the banality of evil. Indeed, they embodied it far more accurately than the sort of man to which she applied the term, Adolf Eichmann, who both disregarded and relished the effects of his actions on others because he profoundly believed in what he was doing. At the center of corporate complicity was my mundane and myopic dedication to short-term self-interest, whether defined as monetary returns, personal advancement, or individual and corporate survival. As Raoul Hilberg, one of the pioneers of Holocaust studies, observed, in most German organizations throughout the Holocaust, quote, normal procedures were employed as if extreme decisions were not being made, unquote. The main impetus behind this ethical numbness was a relentless focus on oneself and one's own blinkered priorities. So what's the point of this long story? Refusing to defend people as a group can lead to persecuting them as such. Once the haters acquire power and the capacity to mold human self-interest, including firms' self-interests, to their purposes, and once this process gathers momentum, it is far harder to stop than to accept, far harder to reject the justifications than to begin to echo them. The results were catastrophic, especially for Jews, but also for the Germans themselves, but not for most of the big business figures who collaborated with Nazism. True, some of these executives were caught up in the Nuremberg military tribunal proceedings against the leading directors of Flick, Krupp, and IG Farben, and Karl Rasche of the Dresdner Bank, and Paul Pleiger of the Reichswerke Hermann Göring. I'll give you a quick idea of what this rogues gallery looked like. Friedrich Flick was one of the major steel and coal industrialists. He was tried separately. Krupp was the leader of the famous Krupp firm. He was not the leader during most of the history of the Third Reich. He was the leader from 1943 on. He was tried. The board of directors of IG Farben, some 23 members, were put on trial. Karl Rasche is the fourth one you see here, and he was from the Dresdner Bank. And this Paul Pleiger is the man at the top, who was tried at Nuremberg, and he was the head of the Reichswerke Hermann Göring. The man at the bottom on the left that you see there is Hermann Röchling, who was a big steel magnate, and he was put on trial by the French because he lived in their occupation zone. But at all of these trials, both the prosecution and the defense badly distorted the historical record. On the one hand, the prosecutors emphasized claims of a conspiracy between business and the Nazi regime that never happened, and ignored the opportunism and self-protection that did. On the other hand, the defenses stressed compulsion as an excuse, even though it was far less important than the industrialists' swift acquiescence and adaptation to the Nazi regime's purposes and continuous desire to profit from them. Though convictions outnumbered acquittals, I'm going to go forward. Though convictions outnumbered acquittals, the sentences were generally mild. Only the verdict in the Krupp case got to the heart of corporations' liability, and all of the condemned executives were released by 1951, making the longest time served 6 years. For the next 4 to 5 decades, German industry engaged in a remarkably successful PR campaign, at least within the country, to load responsibility for the crimes of Nazi Germany, especially its exploitative policies in occupied Europe and toward forced and slave labor, onto Nazi fanatics and the German state they controlled, and thus to avoid paying any financial compensation. Meanwhile, corporations hoarded remarkably extensive archives while blocking research into what actually had happened. Both these dams against reparations and research broke in the aftermath of German unification in 1990, resulting in payments of almost 5 billion euros to the relatively few surviving forced and slave laborers. And two, I've got to go. And two, a flood of publications, which you see in a bookshelf that comes from my study. These are things that have been produced in the last 30 years about this subject, and that's a subset. A flood of publications based on these archives that made this lecture possible. Thank you very much for your attention. Sure.
All right, so maybe just a few questions for Dr. Hayes. Seems like we've got plenty of time. Yeah, and then maybe just your name.
My name is Marty Belsky. What was the role of lawyers for these businesses all during this period of time?
You work for them.
There was no independent, they tried to do, were they parallel to this development?
The judiciary was, if anything, coordinated more rapidly than the corporations were. Because, as is true in the United States, lawyers are officers of the court. And in Germany, they were also officers of the court. And one of the first things the Nazis broke down was the independence of the judiciary. So judges were made to swear an oath to Hitler in the spring of 1933. They were also, the German judicial system was highly hierarchical because the Nazis eliminated the federal states right away. And that meant that all the state bar associations were now all under the National Bar Association. And the Chancellor Hitler controlled who rose and fell within.
How about business lawyers? I understand.
Yeah, well, the business lawyers did what the corporations wanted them to do. They worked for the corporation. They worked out the contracts on the terms of which they bought things and so on. They worked out the severance agreements. Although, again, one of the funny things about the banking records that you see is you can, I know what happened with the severance pay of people who worked in industrial corporations because the records of the bank representative on their boards are preserved in the banking archives. And that's where I find them. And the banks kept great archives. So you can see who negotiated the deal. And there are a couple examples in the book where they had some leeway in how they negotiated these deals. There were lawyers and board members who were more generous than others. There were board members and lawyers who were awful. Anybody here in this room own a Porsche? I'll tell you a quick story about that. The man who made Ferdinand Porsche was a Jew named Hans Rosenberg. And Hans Rosenberger was the rain man for the Porsche operation as it was starting during the Depression. Not a good time to start a business. And it was a automobile design company. Rosenberger was the guy who drummed up investments. And he carried Porsche through the Depression. And in 1935, Porsche dumped him. Why? Because Porsche had acquired the contract to design the Volkswagen. And that was a public allocation of money. Having a Jew on your staff as a prominent partner, not good. So he dumped him. And Rosenberger took it because he wanted to get out of the country, and he went as the Porsche representative to France. And then in 1938, as things were also getting more difficult, he wanted to go to America. And he went back to a man named Piège, who was Porsche's son-in-law, and tried to get some help in going to America. And Piège absolutely stonewalled, said nothing. You get nothing. And that's an example of the hard-hearted attitude. And then there were other people who were very generous. The guy you saw up there, I.G. Farben, Karl Bosch. I.G. Farben did terrible things, but Karl Bosch took care of all of his Jewish associates and planted them at an American subsidiary, Agfa, which made photographic film. The company was in New York, and they put them there. So there were people who were good, and there were people who were nasty. I always answer the first question very lengthily, because that discourages other questions. All right, go ahead.
I've got a couple questions for you, but I'm not trying to steal anybody else's. Firstly, obviously, most of your work involved like a lot of the German local companies there. What was a lot of the role of some of the American companies that were either participatory, like Coke Fanta, or with kind of in agreement with Nazi ideology, like Henry Ford at the time?
In the first place, all foreign companies in Nazi Germany, with the exception of Warner Brothers in Hollywood, behaved as if they were German companies. And they conformed. And so Woolworths had 100 stores in Germany, and they conformed. Some of which were licensees, and they were owned by Jews, and they made sure that that was not the case. Coca-Cola conformed. It began with employees. Ford did transfer 1 or 2 Jewish employees to the States, but mostly just fired people. GM owned Opel, which was a small German car maker. That is, they made small cars. They were a big company. They got rid of them. So all of these companies conformed, and so did all the Swiss companies that were in Germany, all the Swedish companies, all the British companies, everybody. And the rule of the time was so different from contemporary mentality, because the rule of the time was you don't interfere in the domestic affairs of another country. Diplomats had that attitude, which is one of the reasons why very few foreigners ever spoke up against the persecution. We have a terrible record of admitting people to this country in the 1930s, but one of the proud moments is when the Kristallnacht pogrom occurred. There's only one nation on the globe that withdrew its ambassador from Germany, and that was us. Nobody else. They all said, that's your business, it's not ours to comment on. And so this was the attitude of the companies. Alfred P. Sloan, who was the head of General Motors at the time, said, it's the job of a business to respect the local norms. And that's what they did. So they all conformed. Now Henry Ford is, of course, an extreme example, because he was outspoken in his anti-Semitism, he was outspoken in the early 20s already, and so forth. But many of the companies that were represented in Germany were, not big employers of Jews back here, from which one may infer that there was a fair degree of anti-Semitism in the upper reaches of some of these companies. And so that made it easier for them to conform in this way. The one thing you have to remember, though, about in looking at these companies is the Nazis had them by the neck because you couldn't repatriate your profits. So Ford sold cars in Germany and they made money. It just piled up in Germany. You couldn't convert the German mark to dollars. And so if they were going to sell out, they would have had to sell out to a German or foreign country that would pay in foreign exchange. And what foreign country was going to buy into Nazi Germany? Or you could sell out to a local person and write the whole thing off. But corporate executives like to say all previous investments are sunk, but they don't like to act that way. And so they all felt inhibited because they thought, well, we'll accumulate the profits. We can't really invest them in anything innocent because the whole Nazi economy was geared toward war. So we'll just let them pile up. And maybe this regime will change, maybe something will happen, and then we can collect it. And they do after 1945. all does pile up. And GM collects the opal profits, some of which were made building armaments, and Ford collects the Ford profits, and GM and Ford stonewall reparations claims, just like as if they were a German company in the 1950s and 60s.
With that, was there any evidence of like GM Opal or any of the like local Ford places like doing anything on the level of like Harmon with using slave labor, like local workers?
Ford had a very small number of concentration camp inmates. I think it was about 50. They had a lot, however, of what are called forced laborers. That is, they didn't come out of a camp, they were rounded up on the streets of Odessa and sent to Germany. They had several thousand of those. GM avoided both. And this is very unusual because GM became a producer of military equipment. They made no cars during World War II. They made effectively Jeeps, what would be something like a Jeep. And they made aircraft parts. The way the armaments infiltrated GM was first gears for aircraft, and then bombing sites and things like this. And usually slave laborers went to military producers. They had priority in asking for them. And by some unexplained way, GM never did take any. They had a Nazi, a very politically well-connected Nazi, who was the trustee of the factory. And he managed to make them, they operated on regular German employees for the most part. Coca-Cola, we don't know. You know, the history of these, I showed you that bookcase. And that's mostly individual histories of somebody like Quant or companies and so on. You can't do that in the United States, because American companies don't keep the records in the first place. They keep the records of their patents, because that'll be useful in a court of law, but they don't keep the records of the chairman of the board corresponding with the president. And after a certain point, they say, if you put that in a room, it's a cost. It's a cost. You got to maintain it. So get rid of it. And so nobody can write a history of U.S. Steel in the 1930s because the documents aren't there. The one exception to this is what's now Exxon, which was Standard Oil of New Jersey. And they did keep enough that there's an official history that's been written, not necessarily trustworthy because it was written by people who worked for the company, but at least they had papers to work with. Most American companies, you just don't. You can't.
Hi. My name is Lane Horton. I was just wondering, when you were talking about how sometimes they just don't keep as well records, were there any specific companies that you were originally looking into that you just couldn't find the records for?
There's some things, but I'm very lucky. I work in the era of the 1930s and 1940s. That is the era of carbon paper. Everything was in 5 copies, and they get distributed among offices. So, and a lot of these companies in 1945, as the Americans are coming in, or as the Russians are coming in, they burn everything. But if there's 5 copies scattered around, you can't, you know? And when I wrote a history of Degussa, and they made a, I forget exactly what the military product was. They made plexiglass, and they made ballast for submarines. They made all these things. I forget exactly what it was, but I couldn't find anything on it. And I looked in an entirely different file, which had a different heading and so forth, and there it all was. It had been sent, the copies had been sent to that office, and there it is, and so I could write that up. Now there were extreme examples where you know they're covering up, because not only did they burn in 45, but when these corporations began to reacquire their operations, which is 1949, 51, 55 is when the big banks can remerge and so on, they pruned their collections. And the one thing that I noticed, I talked about this company Degesh, which made the Zyklon. Okay, the Degussa manager who ran that company because he was a Degussa employee, but he was the chair of Degish. He was put on trial after the war, 4 times in fact. And I thought that there would be a personnel file for him, because there's a personnel file for most everybody I saw, and that was nowhere to be found. And I thought, okay, they got rid of this. I don't think they were hiding it from him. I think they just got rid of it. I do know that the firm paid for his legal defense after the war, so I knew they were still highly implicated in what had happened. But I couldn't find the document to find out, what was his pension, how long did they pay it, that sort of stuff.
Did
So
he
that
get
was
convicted? Did he get convicted? Did he get convicted?
No. He went through 4 trials. He was given ultimately what a German paper called a 4th-class acquittal, because they said the statute of limitations had run out during all of these trials. He clearly, we know from the documentary record, that he knew what was happening. And so, it's very hard to prove in many of these cases. But in his case, it's completely on paper. So, that was the one occasion where I thought, I smell a rat, but not very often.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
There was some more back here. Yes?
My name is Lisa. During the period of World War II, did the American press contemporaneously expose any of these relationships between American corporations and Schutzstaffel or post-World War II? And was there any
Right, there were a series of hearings in 1942 because, remember, they attacked us, right? So we enter the war very abruptly, and we discover that we're not prepared for the war in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which we were prepared for the war is we had inadequate production of rubber. So then the question was, who do we blame that on? Well, surprise, surprise, congressmen did not want to blame it on themselves. So they hauled in corporate executives who had dealt with IG Farben in the 1930s and said, isn't the problem your cartel agreement with IG Farben that has prevented us from developing synthetic rubber in this country? It turns out that the agreement didn't prevent that Farben had been granted the rights by the Germans in the fall of 1939 to produce it. They had gone to the White House and they'd said, shall we ramp up production in this? And the decision of the American executive was, not until the war starts. It's a waste of money if we don't need it. So let's find out. So there was some scapegoating, is what I'm getting at. And now that we're all these years from it, you can see that it was scapegoating. That Congress had not prepared in that respect adequately, had not appropriated the money. The executive branch had not asked for the money. And so there was a delay in this. That was the flurry of exposure of American connections to Germany. It was all about cartels. It was all about high-level corporate agreements that were in restraint of trade, and those are terrible things. And that was the way it was presented. In retrospect, none of that has turned out to be true. There weren't major inhibitions on our capacity to develop things. But there was an awareness of the connections. And there was suspicion. Ford was very suspect, not only because of Henry Ford, but also because Ford had bought a lot of stock in IG Farben and vice versa. And so that made people suspicious.
Deacon Sloan, I can't remember the operation, I believe it was 41, were any of these gentlemen in the meeting to actually start to move the Jewish population into
No.
that campaign?
No, the Wannsee Conference. No, that was all SS people.
Okay.
And some representatives of civilian ministries who they had to get on the same page. They had to get the representative of the Justice Ministry in to decide where are the boundaries of being a Jew, so that you know who to deport and who not. They brought in, I think, somebody from the Interior Ministry, because that's usually the supervising of police and domestic bureaucracy. But mostly it was SS people. Yeah. And that's a meeting that was simply designed to get everybody on the same page and agree about the deportations. The decision to kill had already been made.
small business. What was the role of small business during this time and the state of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it's really hard to generalize because small business is much more diverse than big business in a sense. But most of the takeovers of Jewish-owned firms were by small businesses, or the Jewish-owned firms were simply liquidated. 75% of the business operations owned by Jews in Germany before 1939 were simply dissolved. And then only about 20%, a little more, were taken over by somebody else. So now that counts as small business, legal practices, dental practices, doctor's practices, and so on. In general, you can say that anti-Semitism was stronger among middle-level business than among big business at the start of the Nazi regime. There was much more sense of, I'm competing with so-and-so down the street, and therefore I don't like so-and-so. And you can see this in the political contributions to the Nazi Party before 1933. The money from big business is largely confined to a guy named Fritz Thyssen, who you may know, you still know the name. If you, in Chicago, all the escalators and the elevators are ThyssenKrupp. So the company is still in business and so on. Thyssen was a big backer of Hitler and gave him money and so forth. But most of the money that the Nazi Party raised before Hitler came into power comes from middle-level people, small-level donations. They're enthusiastic. So that's the generalization, is the degree to which I can generalize.
Hi, I'm Ann Hefner. Going back to the synthetic rubber, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. Does that mean Akron's in your book? Because synthetic rubber.
Goodyear's in my book. In this book less. In the book on there is something about this in the book. In my book on I.G. Farber, there's more about rubber. But the dealings were all with, well, Goodyear was the licensee for the process that was allowed in 1939. And then they also dealt with DuPont, because DuPont had various forms of synthetic rubber that it was experimental. And those were the ties that they had.
Of course, I wanted to highlight Waldo Seaman with B.F. Goodrich, since he was the lead on that project. So I'm always curious, so glad that Akron's in there. Thank you.
There was, you've both been before. I want to be sure everybody gets a chance. All right, let me go one there.
Yeah, first on, I wanted to ask, because you had mentioned earlier on that the big business collaboration was only beneficial in the short term at best. Now, I mean, there was like state control that kind of, had the hand around the throat, so to speak. But I feel that big business is usually able to collaborate with fascist governments around the world very easily. So is there something more than opportunism that drives that?
No and yes. What makes it easy is that you know who you're dealing with. It's a limited number of players in an authoritarian system. And you know that they are transactional, so you know what they want, and that's what makes it easy. Now, is it more than just opportunism? Sometimes, like I said, the leading American corporations in that era are not free of the suspicion of anti-Semitism, so that may have made it easier. A great many, you got to remember, a great many American big business leaders in the 1930s hated Franklin Roosevelt. And they were for anybody who looked to be the opposite. Mussolini was very popular in the upper reaches of conservative America in the 1930s. Hitler was a little harder pill to swallow, and he got harder because of the outrages. But there was generally sort of a sense, they're not left. FDR's left. Stalin is really left. And they look good as a bulwark against communism. So a lot of the way that Hitler operated in America in the 1930s was to constantly stress, we are the barrier in Europe from this great threat. So those things all play in. But within the country, that means that In 1932, when Hitler gets appointed, the leaders of these companies are on the whole mistrustful. They are not in the corridors of power saying, do this, pick him. The people who are in the corridors of power in 1933 saying, pick Hitler, are the big landowners. They're the ones who see what they have to gain by this. And the industrialists aren't sure because, this is going to sound awfully familiar, forgive me, the industrialists aren't sure because Hitler is a protectionist. Hitler is a self-sufficiency guy. The country must be, the word was autarky. The country must produce all it needs so that it can win a war and not be impeded by a blockade. So we got to make everything at home. And that meant he was not interested in foreign trade. Now, a lot of big German corporations in those days made their money off foreign trade. Pharmaceuticals were pharmaceuticals carried IG Farben through the Depression. And they were mostly sold abroad, well over half. So they were nervous that he was going to, he didn't operate with tariffs, he operated in other ways, but he was going to prevent the development of German foreign trade, and that made them suspicious. He was thought to be protectionist of agriculture. What happens if you run tariffs that protect agriculture is food prices rise. When food prices rise, who loses? The people who spend the largest proportion of their income on food, which are poor people. And so there was this, the feeling that that would be bad for consumption in general, because what people had for money would be rooted toward agricultural goods, and they wouldn't be able to buy the things that other people produce. So there was a lot of mistrust of Nazi economic policy, and a lot of sense that Hitler was, he'd never been to college. There was a sense that he was intellectually not equal to the job, and they didn't trust him for those reasons. On the other hand, he was going to smash the trade unions. He was going to expand German power. And so they were ambivalent about this, just like they were ambivalent about anti-Semitism, and it paralyzed them. So they can't act as a group the way the big landowners do. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Reese, and this is a clarifying question about, forgive me if I butcher these, I probably forgot the names already, Wilhelm Ritten and George Meif.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
And they were both executed
Yep.
for speaking out against the Nazi regime. Did they play a bigger role within those big businesses, or were they more on the government part of?
No, Mita was one of 50 directors of the Deutsche Bank, so he's pretty high up. And Ricken was the chief of that company. And what their offense is they're overheard saying, well, what Mita said was that, they were both overheard saying, we're going to lose the war. It's all over. And I think Mita also said some disparaging things about Goering and Goebbels and Hitler. And they were overheard and they were denounced. And that's what could happen to anybody. And then the big thing is, of course, these people at the top of these companies, they all know each other. They all go to Chamber of Commerce meetings together and so forth. It gets whispered around. I mean, the Mita thing, they made an example of him in the newspaper. But anybody who was punished in any way, everybody else heard about it. And that too, because it's kind of whispered about, increased the fear. Now, what you'll notice, I was at pains to say it wasn't easy to resist in this context. It wasn't easy to say no. But we're talking about the slaughtering of millions of people. It's not supposed to be. It doesn't have to be easy. You have to be able to stand up on that. And these people lose the ability to stand up because they give in, and before they know it, they don't know what they're against anymore, let alone how they can be against it. And that's the process that you can see with this, because this is essentially civilians, and you see the ways in which they cave. And the stakes were very high. You may have, I had a throwaway line there at the end where you said, I said the only judgment that got to the heart of their liability was the Krupp case. This is because the judges in the Krupp case said, there's this very powerful passage in the middle. It said, you know, these people are saying that their defense is they were made to do it. And what the judges say is that defense only works when the threat to you is equal to the threat you are fending off. You follow me? So if the threat you're fending off is that people are going to be killed, they're going to be made slave laborers and tortured to death, and then they're going to die. And the thing you're fending off is, I don't want to lose my job. That's what the Krupp judges said. And none of the other judges do this. It's called, I think the word they use is, no it's not, I think it was commensurate, but I don't think that's right. But they use a legal term that says it must be the same. And then there's this long paragraph where they said, the threat to these people was nothing like what would happen to these people in a slave labor camp. And so maybe they get, these people get executed, but maybe short of that, they'd send you to a concentration camp. The condition of a German in a concentration camp was infinitely better than the position of the people who they were persecuting. So even the worst threat to them was not the same. And that seems to me to be the one moment in these judgments where they get it right. And many, there are still a lot of people who use the duress defense. I had to do it, they made me do it, I would have been punished. But the answer is, would you have been punished the same as the people who you could have helped? And that's pretty powerful. Yes?
Thanks for being here, Dr. Hayes. This is awesome. The philosophies and extremism of Jews and gypsies and the Nazi, their philosophy goes back even way before, right? And we know that. In your research, is there anything you found that might connect where the Nazis said, we're going to use this extreme view that we have, we're going to use it because what we really want, or another goal that we have, is to consolidate wealth and power for our party. And maybe you did find some in the research and the historical record, or maybe it was different.
Oh no, this is the heart and soul of Hitler's mission. The heart and soul of Hitler's mission is to accumulate wealth and power for the German people. And he saw the world as dog eat dog, all the time. Everybody's fighting over the same thing. What are they fighting over? Remember, he was a good Catholic boy. Their daily bread. The resources that grow your food. And the resources that you need to win a competition. And so the whole objective is to accumulate wealth and power for the German people and to make sure other people don't get it. And however, in this is embedded the notion that Jews are the mortal opponents of that, the most dangerous opponents. Gypsies are not dangerous. They're just, the Nazis look down on them and say they're not useful. Gay people are not really dangerous. It's just gay German men don't do their duty by the folk by reproducing. And you need the reproduction in order to win wealth and power. So you punish gay German men. But they didn't punish any other gay men in Europe unless they were having sex with a German man. Then they got punished. But they couldn't care less if a Pole in Warsaw was getting it on with somebody else, because who wants more Poles from his point of view? So this was, everybody else had a different reason. The Jews are this mythical, powerful force that can stop the German acquisition of everything. And therefore they are uniquely the ones who have to be wiped out, root and branch, everybody. And so the objective is wealth and power. The objective is victory in the international struggle. And if they're the principal barrier, you wipe them out. Now, they don't say that from the beginning. They talk about removal, talk about removing Jewish influence from Germany. And so not only the Jews themselves, but their ideas. Because the Jews are connected to ideas of international harmony, human rights, all these ethical principles that the Nazis find very inconvenient in the struggle. You know, the Sermon on the Mount is a real impediment to winning. So it's not just the Jews, it's that kind of Christianity. And so, you know, you win at all costs. The Marquis of Queensberry rules are bad, and the Jews are the fundamental enemy. So in the first stage, you get them out, because then you can build up German strength for the expanding. But then when you start to expand, you get more Jews. And what do you do with that? And so the Nazis get caught in 1938 kind of chasing their own tails, because they've driven a third of the Jews of Germany out. And in 1938, they get Austria and the Sudetenland, and in 1939, they get the Czech provinces, and they acquire almost as many Jews as they have driven out in the preceding 5 years.
Imagine if they had gotten Russia, how many more Jews they would have gotten.
Well, then, and their intention is to go there. And so now that's the moment where the penny drops for the SS, because they think they're going east. In Poland, there are 3.3 million Jews. In Russia, there may be 4.5. And so you realize, okay, if we're going to get rid of them, if we're going to remove them, and we're going where they all are, what do? Then you just sort of say, how? You already know what you're going to do. You just try to figure out how. And they knew they had the capacity to do it, because they'd already been killing non-Jews by gas in mental institutions and sanatoria around Germany. And so they knew they had the method, and the question was just how do we transplant that over there, and then it all falls into place as it